Welcome in, everyone, to another edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host, as always, Tommy Brzee. It is Wednesday, July 31st around here, and we have a great show for you today. We're going to start talking a little bit about Michigan. The punishment sounds like is going to come out pretty soon for the Michigan sign stealing scandal, and we will get into all of the details on that. Definitely a very interesting thing that is going to unfold over really the next about 6 months to a year with some of the legal battles, but we'll get into all the details there. Then we'll get into some of the ACC breakdown. We'll get a little bit on every single team, just quick thoughts there. Then we'll get into ACC picks. We'll break down all of my picks for the ACC schedule. Definitely a little bit weirder than the first 2 days in the SEC and the Big Ten, so definitely a cool one today. Then we'll get into schedules around the Power Four. We'll get into who the winners, who the losers, who are the people that, have it pretty easy this year, who are the ones that are going to be facing a fight pretty much every single weekend. And then we'll get into Wednesday what ifs, and we'll do kind of a week one edition, some of the different questions I have around week one, including what happens if there is a blowout in the Notre Dame Texas A&M game. But before we jump in, I do want to remind you all we get tons of questions and comments throughout the show, and the best way for you all to get your question on the screen, we can have a fun back and forth here, is to use the tip and donation link at the bottom of the screen, gsmcpodcast.net. It's a huge help not only to us here at the network, but to you all. You get to kind of have a fun, interactive experience here, and I think that's always good for the both of us. Again, if you would like to use that, that is gsmcpodcast.net. But let's get into the Michigan punishment, because this has kind of been going around the Twitterverse, going around, college football world for the last couple of days, that it is likely going to be coming out pretty soon. The NCAA is likely to make their decision on what the punishment will be for the sign stealing allegations that unfolded pretty much last year, but have been unfolding for the last couple of years, it seems, at Michigan. And a lot of different things go into this, obviously. Connor Stalions is at the very center of this. He will likely be the one that's facing the most of the brunt, all right? He's the one that's definitely going to get the most attention, I suppose, as we get into this. It sounds like Jim Harbaugh is not mentioned in the report that came out a couple of days ago, which is a little bit crazy to me. I'll be totally honest with you. I think the head coach of a team that, if you're willing to ban them from multiple postseasons, which is something that they're kicking around the idea, whether it's 2 or 1 year postseason ban, plus a big time fine. Michigan doesn't much care about the big time fine, but on the other side of things, that will definitely create some more questions, which we'll get into here in a second. But in the hypothetical where you are willing to suspend a team from the postseason for 2 years, the head coach of that team not getting any punishment is a little bit wild to me. I understand he's in the NFL. I understand he has left the university, but it still feels a little bit weird that Jim Harbaugh just kind of up and left and is scot-free, I suppose. So that's a little bit weird. Definitely something that is going to get the NCAA a little bit of heat during this process, but overall, Connor Stalions is also facing failure to cooperate in the investigation. That makes sense from what everything we heard last year. Doesn't sound like he was very inclined to help out by any means, so that's not necessarily overly surprising. No current Michigan staffers are facing allegations of violation, so that's a little bit interesting. Definitely something that kind of lends itself to maybe they didn't quite find exactly what everyone expected them to find in this investigation. Maybe they didn't find, very specific things. They did say that one coach allegedly deleted text messages between him and Connor Stalions. That's really weird, right? That's definitely something that I'd like to know who that coach is. I'd like to know what the texts were, all of that information, but it's definitely one of those things that if you can't recover the text, then you can't really know what was said, and you can't necessarily punish the coach for that. So it's it'll be an interesting battle back and forth. But one of the big time things here is if the NCAA does kind of ban them for the postseason, whether it's 1 or 2 seasons, it sounds like 2 seasons might be on the table, a little bit more than 1, but I would probably lean more towards 1. The question is, what happens, to the past wins and the past, national championship that they just won? Sounds like those are safe. It sounds like they will not be touched and definitely will not be something that is included in this case, vacating those wins or anything like that. So something that definitely people will have some mixed opinions on. But overall, I think if you can't necessarily prove that there was an aggressive advantage made by this, then I guess you can't necessarily take away those wins. So I'm not necessarily overly against that by any means, but the big time question here is, what does Michigan do on the backside of it? Because the reality is, once all of this information started to roll out, Michigan probably started to make some plans, and I think they were likely legal plans, because if you were going to bar them from the postseason, you are likely taking a lot of money out of their pocket. And if you can't necessarily prove that, there was this massive advantage found, and obviously more of this information will come out and we'll absolutely unpack it as it does. But overall, it sounds like Michigan is going to fight this postseason ban once it is handed down. And that's definitely something that will be really interesting to watch over the next little bit. But let's just say the 2-season postseason ban goes through. Let's just say they are barred from the postseason for the next 2 years, and then in 2026 they get, or I guess it would be 2027 because they can't be banned this year. But overall, if they, get a chance after 2 years to get back into the dance, but in those 2 years, a lot can happen. This is a very, very quickly changing sport, and I think there's too many people in that conference now for Michigan to take their foot off the gas pedal. When you add teams like Oregon and USC and Washington, and then you already have teams like Nebraska and Iowa and Wisconsin that are already making some changes in their program, add that to Ohio State and Penn State already, you're going to have to, be on your game 24/7, 365. That's just the reality of this game right now. And if you can't be that, if you can't be all the way locked in, and especially if you're barred from the postseason, you're going to struggle in a number of different ways. Whether that's, transfer portal guys, they're not going to come in because they don't have all the time in the world. They don't necessarily have 2-3 years for this postseason ban to expire so they can play meaningful football at the end of the season again. So that's kind of the big thing here is it could really affect this team in a number of different ways. And transfer portal is just a part of it. Recruiting could definitely be another part where if you're a freshman kid that's coming into Michigan, obviously you're not necessarily expecting to start, but you want to be a part of a postseason run. That's just the reality of the sport when all of the onus is put on the playoff, which I don't necessarily love too much, but that's the reality of it right now. If that's the case, then kids are not going to look your direction if you have no earthly shot to get in. It sounds like the college football playoff would abide by this if it was handed down by the NCAA. So this is obviously something that Michigan's going to want to fight because you will get affected in recruiting. You will get affected in the transfer portal. You will get affected in NIL. And I think that might be the most important part where there are some boosters that, frankly, they're not the most die-hard college football fans. They're not the most die-hard Michigan football fans, but they see Michigan ticking up in the rankings. They see that record getting better and better last year, and they start to buy in. That's just the reality of a lot of pretty much every single program out there has those types of donors, and you'd likely lose them pretty quickly if you had a postseason ban because you don't necessarily have the same draw. You don't necessarily have the same allure to those casual fans, if you will. So that's a big battle that they're going to be able to fight over the next little bit. And if it's a 1-year postseason ban, I think that's something that won't necessarily hurt too bad, but absolutely can have an effect. We'll obviously figure out what the big-time effects of that could be. But overall, I think 2 seasons would be just a little bit too long. It would definitely be a problem for Michigan. Not to say that I wouldn't necessarily give them a 2-year postseason ban. I would tend to lean towards 1, but overall, if more information comes out, my entire tune on this could totally change. But overall, I think when we talk about this, they're going to fight this. There's no two ways about that. There have been some people that have poked fun at it saying, why would you have to fight back if you didn't cheat? That's a little bit ridiculous. Obviously, you're going to fight back if you feel like it's going to do something negative to your program. There's no two ways about that. It doesn't matter who you are. It doesn't matter what you did. You're definitely going to try to fight it if you feel like you have grounds to fight it. So Michigan is definitely doing, hypothetically, the right thing here. And I think when you look at the conference that they're in, the landscape in college football right now, they can't miss a beat. So they definitely need to fight it if the postseason ban does come down. Now, how much success they'll have there, I don't know. It definitely will be an interesting fight and one that will likely yield more information about what was happening in Michigan. And I think that's what we all want, right? We definitely want to know more about what was going on, more about, how they were going about business in this new era at Michigan football. And definitely want to know about more what Connor Stalions and what this coaching staff had to play in this part. But overall, I think this will be a very long-winded thing. There's no two ways about that. I don't think Michigan is leaving any stone unturned. I think they're going to try to get out of this any which way possible. And frankly, pretty much every single other school would do the exact same. So it's not necessarily tearing apart Michigan for doing that. It's just to say this is the reality of the sport. You definitely have to fight some legal battles that you didn't used to have to fight, and Michigan got themselves into this battle. There's no two ways about that, but it's definitely going to be a very interesting one. Obviously, we talked about the Netflix special that is coming out around Connor Stalions and the sign stealing scandal and how it's going to be very, very interesting to watch. There's no two ways about that. It's definitely a good idea to get the punishment out there beforehand. Definitely have something on the books, even if you are fighting in courts and doing all of that type of stuff. As long as you have something in writing before that thing comes out, I think you're in good shape, because I talked about it before when I talked about the documentary, but a lot of people are going to make some pretty staunch opinions after that thing comes out, and you don't want to be on the wrong side of that if you're the NCAA. So overall, I think it makes sense that all of this is starting to happen now. I do think Michigan is going to fight this pretty tooth and nail and try to get to the very finish line and definitely try to save themselves from any postseason ban. Whatever the fine is, Michigan will pay that and keep moving forward. I don't think that's ever going to be really much of an issue for Michigan, but overall, there's definitely going to be a lot of stuff here, and there's definitely going to be some more information about how Connor Stalions went about his business, if the coaching staff knew. All of those little details that we've kind of waited for quite some time will start to come out over the next little bit, and we'll get more and more information, but it does sound like the NCAA is going to be battling them for a little bit, and Michigan is going to fight right back, and we'll see what happens there. It's definitely one of those things that took the college football world by storm last year, and it was one of those things that was a little bit hard to wrap your head around because some of the details were very much unknown, and there were a lot of different conspiracy theories and different ideas going around. Now we'll at least know something sort of concrete. I don't think we'll get all the information that we want by any means, but I do think we'll get a little bit more information about what was going on at Michigan, how egregious was it, and do they deserve a 1, 2, 3, whoever, postseason ban. So it's definitely going to be a very, very interesting thing, and I think it's just another chapter in the best reality TV show in the world, which is college football. It'll be very, very weird to watch this unfold, but I'll be watching very closely, obviously, and update you guys with everything that you need to know. But let's take our first break here, and when we come back, we're going to break down all the ACC teams before we get into our predictions. So just do quick thoughts on all 17 teams in the ACC. So stick around, and we'll be right back with that.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Alrighty, welcome back, everyone. We just talked about the Michigan punishment that is going to be handed down by the NCAA. Sounds like it is going to be something around the tune of a fine and some type of postseason ban, but the postseason ban will be fought by Michigan, so plenty of updates to come on that for sure. But let's get into the ACC breakdown here, give you quick thoughts on every single team before I give you my big-time predictions. And there are some really interesting teams in this conference. There's no two ways about that. We'll start with Boston College. Bill O'Brien makes his debut as the head coach of the Golden Eagles, a very, very interesting team going into this year, and one that I think there's not really an easy way to get a beat on because Bill O'Brien brings his own offense, so it'll be really interesting to see what happens there. And Thomas Castellanos is a very, very fun player at quarterback. There's no two ways about that. Definitely someone that can cause problems for really any defense out there. So this is a very interesting team. I don't necessarily think it's going to be a gangbusters year up in Boston, but overall I do think it's going to be a team that is going to build into something, and Thomas Castellanos is someone that any given Saturday could be a problem for you, that's for sure. And then you have Cal, another team that is going to be I don't want to say dragged, but is going to be around one player, and it's that guy right there. Jaden Ott is the dude. Cal making their debut in the ACC this year. They really are going to have likely a pretty tough year, if I'm being totally honest. I think the quarterback situation is okay between Chandler Rogers and Fernando Mendoza, but overall, I don't feel great about it. I think Tobias Merriweather is an interesting guy to watch. If they're going to do anything, Jaden Ott just has to be out of this world, honestly. So it'll be an interesting team to watch. But overall, if you're watching number one in Cal, you'll be more than fine. I can promise that. Clemson is a really interesting team, as always. This is the team that everyone is watching. They're watching Dabo very closely, and they will dunk on him pretty much immediately if they fail again this year. Go anything 9-3 or worse, 10-2 or worse in some cases, would not be enough for this Clemson team. Kay Klubnik and Garrett Riley finding the same page, getting in a groove is going to be huge for this team. The wide receivers do look much better than they have in years past, with Bryant Wesco coming in, TJ Moore, Tyler Moore, a lot of really talented guys on that team. Phil Maffa is an absolute dude at running back. The defense is going to be stifling. I'm a little bit worried about that back end, but I think it'll be mostly okay. They do have an elite defensive line and linebacker core, as they pretty much always do. So Clemson will have plenty to say in this conference, that's for sure. Duke is an interesting team, inviting a lot of new things into their locker room this year. Mike Elko and Riley Leonard leave. Manny Diaz and Malik Murphy come on in. So definitely will be a really interesting thing to watch. I think it'll be Malik Murphy. I bounce back and forth between him and Grayson Loftus for the last little bit, but I do think it's going to be Malik Murphy at the end of the day. I thought Grayson Loftus about a week ago, so maybe I'll flip my mind in the week now. But overall, I think this is a very dangerous team. I don't necessarily think they're going to do anything crazy this year, but when you have a guy like Malik Murphy who has that ability to just sling the ball all over the field, be very explosive down the field, and you can put together a solid defense, you can definitely be a spoiler in this conference. There's no two ways about that, kind of like the Duke team was last year. Florida State is the other team that everyone is watching, the on-odds favorite to win this, or maybe it's Clemson. They've bounced back and forth quite a bit, but Florida State did end last year on a very, very bad note. There's no two ways about that. They don't want to leave any doubt this time. They don't want anything creeping into anyone's head, whether it's injury or anything else related. They have a ton of transfers coming in that are going to play big-time roles. DJ Uiagalelei is the main guy. The responses, or the talk out of fall camp, has been absolutely glowing around him, saying that he is going through this offense really, really efficiently, and definitely one of those things that Florida State fans just need this season. You also have Roydell Williams, Malik Benson, and many more that are going to play big-time roles offensively, and then on the defense, it's going to be really good. Patrick Payton is leading the way there, but they got plenty of guys that are going to make plenty of plays this fall. But Georgia Tech is a really interesting team, and I think they might just be the number one dark horse in this conference, if you were to ask me. They have pretty much they can pretty much score with anyone, is what I mean. And they stole Duke's defensive coordinator, Tyler Santucci, to up their defensive play. If all of that can happen, this can be a really interesting team. Haynes King is in full control of this offense, which makes it really hard for any defense to get comfortable. Brent Key said he's the best quarterback in the conference, and while I don't necessarily agree with that, I do think he's much higher than some people give him credit for. He's a very talented player and someone that is going to be really hard to overlook this year. So I don't necessarily know if Georgia Tech's going to find their way to Charlotte, but I know they're going to win a game that is going to make some people surprised, kind of like that Miami game a year ago. Then you have Louisville, a team coming off just a massive year last year, one of the biggest years they've had in year one of the Jeff Brom era, and I think this is a very dangerous team. You talk about someone like Colin Lacey coming in from South Alabama, that is a total game changer. The other guy they have coming in is Tyler Shuck. He will be taking over at quarterback, and I do have some questions around him. Didn't necessarily love what I saw at Texas Tech, but when you put him in that Jeff Brom offense that is so quarterback friendly, he could definitely make some noise. This is a team that has built up a lot of energy going into 2024, and although a lot of the talk has been around Miami, Florida State, Clemson, they're going to have plenty to say this year, I can promise that. Miami is the team that is the hype team. This is the team that everyone is watching, kind of like the Ole Miss of the ACC. Everyone is pointing to them as the team that can make some noise this year, and Cam Ward is the main reason for that. He is someone that totally changes the complexion of this team and what they're capable of this year. There's no two ways about that. Ruben Bain on the other side of the ball is frankly the best player in the ACC, period. I feel pretty confident in that. He is an absolute beast and is going to be an outright problem for any offensive tackle he faces, if I'm being totally honest. Definitely an absolute beast and someone that is going to have plenty to say in Miami season this year. North Carolina State is another very interesting team. They brought in a ton of transfers. Grayson McCall leading the way at quarterback. Jordan Waters, Noah Rogers, Justin Jolie, all really talented skill players from all over the place. Jordan Waters from Duke, who was just incredible last year for their run. I think this is a team that is going to surprise some people. They have ability all over the field. I think Grayson McCall, if he can fully tap into that 2021 team, they can absolutely be, or 2021 football they was playing, excuse me. This is absolutely a team that can make an ACC title run. Now, if he misses that by a little bit, it might be a little bit tougher, but overall, this is a really, really interesting team this year. North Carolina is another one that everyone pretty much has to watch every single year because Mac Brown and that program have always made it really interesting one way or the other. It's either they're playing way better football than you expected and they beat someone they shouldn't, or they lose to someone they shouldn't and they play down to them. So it'll be an interesting team one way or the other. Max Johnson coming in as the starting quarterback is someone that I think can be steady enough. I don't think he has to be special because the guy right next to him is really special. Omarion Hampton is one of the best running backs in the entire country and definitely a guy that can just outright win a game for you. So UNC is going to ride him quite a bit and definitely someone that they very much like and pretty much everyone likes right about now. But a very talented kid that will have plenty to say in the North Carolina season. Pittsburgh is a team that is a little bit funny because they've just been kind of hanging out up there in Pittsburgh, not really saying a lot, and there's still some questions around this team, like who is going to start at quarterback. Nate Yarnell seems to be the leader right now, but Eli Holstein came in from Alabama this offseason and is a very, very talented kid. I don't know if this is one of those situations where Nate Yarnell starts the year and then doesn't necessarily end it, but it's going to be a rather tough year for the Panthers, I would say. I think they're a team that could make some noise, and if they can find a difference maker on offense, then this conversation totally changes. But I do think this is a team that is likely in for a relatively rough 2024. SMU is a really, really interesting team, and I think people just aren't really talking about them enough. The duo of Preston Stone and RJ Maryland is really, really solid in that pass game, and I think they have a slew of running backs, whether you're talking about LJ Johnson, Kamar Wheaton. They have tons of guys that are going to be able to make some noise in this offense, and I think they're going to be a real problem, and there's no two ways about that. I don't necessarily know if they're going to, make the noise that everyone or they're going to, win the ACC and go to the playoff, but I do think they're going to win one or two games that everyone just does not expect by any means. Stanford is a team that I wish I could say better things about. I think they're a really fun team and someone that can definitely build into a contender in this conference. They do have Ashton Daniels at quarterback, a really talented quarterback that can really run this offense fairly solidly. Menor, is really awesome on the outside, kind of made Travis Hunter look a little goofy last year in that game, so definitely a team that has that boost potential, has that pop potential, but overall, not necessarily super into the Cardinal this year. Syracuse is one of those teams that I'm probably the most excited about in this conference. You talk about Fran Brown going up there, and in really 8 months has kind of changed the perception and definitely the trajectory of that program. There's no two ways about that. Kyle McCord under center is absolutely huge. He didn't reach the heights that Ohio State fans had for him. I like to think he's going to reach the heights that Syracuse fans have for him. Zeed Haynes coming in at wide receiver is huge. Devin Grant is someone I've talked about a lot. I think he is a great player on the back end of that defense. So I think there's going to be a really fun team that might just cause some problems for some of the people up top. Virginia is a team that is likely going to face a tough battle in 2024. They are a very interesting team, have some players that can make some noise. Anthony Coulandria is a very, very talented, athletic quarterback, but not necessarily up to the standard of the rest of the quarterbacks in the conference. Chris Tyree is an interesting wide receiver they brought in from Notre Dame that can make plays in a number of different ways, slot, outside, returning the ball, a number of different ways that he can get his hands on the ball. But overall, I think there's a team that's likely fighting an uphill battle in 2024. Virginia Tech is the other team that is super interesting to me. Kyron Jones is an absolute beast at quarterback, someone that can absolutely be one of the very best players in this conference and lead Virginia Tech to an ACC title this year. Jalen Lane on the outside is really awesome, is going to be an absolute monster this year, and I think Anais Peebles on the inside of that defense is absolutely huge pickup from Duke. So overall, this is a team that returns a lot of talent and brought in a couple of guys to fill some of those holes. So they're going to have a ton to say about this ACC year and could be that team that kind of shocks the world this upcoming year. Wake Forest to close it out here, and they brought in Hank Bockermeyer to be their quarterback, and frankly, I'd forgotten about Hank Bockermeyer, but very, very cool to see him at the Power 4 level. A very talented quarterback that played good football at Boise State during his time. They did lose two huge players on the outside, Jamal Banks, Elijah Surratt, very, very talented guys. But overall, I think this team is likely fighting an uphill battle. Dave Clawson always makes something happen, so I think it's a team that will likely make a couple of games more interesting than you expect. But overall, I don't necessarily think they're a team that is going to be worried about too much this year in the ACC. So overall, this is a really fun conference. There's so many different teams that can make some noise. I think everyone points to Florida State and Clemson, but there's about 4 or 5 teams other than that can absolutely make it to Charlotte, and we'll break down exactly who I think is going to make it to Charlotte and who I think is the offensive player of the year, defensive transfer of the year, freshman of the year, everything that you need to know right after this, so stick with us.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube to catch one of your new favorite shows, like the GSMC College Football Podcast, Chip Shot Football Podcast, Hoops and Heels Women's Sports Podcast, GSMC Basketball Podcast, and so many more. Check it out for yourself. GSMC Sports Network, now available on YouTube absolutely free. Search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube right now.
Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just gave a little tidbit about every single team in the ACC, and now it's time to make some predictions. And this one's a little bit weirder than the past couple of days. I know I've been a little bit bland with my picks, going with the top 2 teams making it into the into the championship game for the SEC and the Big Ten, but this one's definitely a little bit different, that is for sure. So let's go ahead and jump right in, and there's definitely going to be some people that have some questions. So let's jump into this thing. I do think Miami is a team that is ready to make some noise. I do think they are going to stumble at some point in the out-of-conference. You might be able to figure out where, but that's beside the point. We'll get to that. Virginia Tech is another team that I just think is really, really good. I just think they have so many things in place and are absolutely a team that is going to be able to possibly get to that Miami game undefeated, and then if you win that one, you're off running. There's no two ways about that, and definitely a team that can make a run to an ACC title and possibly even win one, but we'll get to that here in a second. SMU is the team that I think is going to be the big shocker here. I think they are going to make a lot of plays this year. I think they have plenty of guys on either side of the ball. I think that offense is going to be remarkably hard to deal with for pretty much any defense in this conference, and their schedule sets up pretty well for them to make an attack here. Florida State is a team that I think is really good. I really do think is going to be a really, really solid team and definitely be a team that has plenty of an argument to make it into the playoff, but I just don't trust DJ the same way that some other people do. And I understand why people do trust him. I understand the ceiling is incredibly high, but overall, I just don't necessarily see what everyone else sees there. Clemson, I do have going 9-3. One of those losses you can likely pinpoint. But overall, I think this is a team that just has too many questions for me. I think when it comes to the way that they're going about business on offense, I don't feel confident that Cade Klubnik is going to be able to make the plays that he needs to make down the stretch. I think on the defensive side of the ball, that back end does have RJ Mickens. They do have Avion Terrell, but overall, I don't think it's that great of a unit, and I think there's too many great passing attacks in this conference to not have a great unit back there. So I do think Clemson stumbles a little bit. I think they continue to have these seasons that, are good seasons by about 90% of the country's standards, but not by Clemson's, and that's the reality, and the heat around Dabo Swinney will kick up just a little bit more. North Carolina State, I talked about, is a really fun team that I think is absolutely going to have plenty to say in this conference. They are a very talented team, especially on the offensive side of the ball, and will definitely be a really, really interesting one this fall. I think Louisville is a team that I just see too many questions. I don't love Tyler Shuck, if I'm being totally honest, and I think there's enough defenses in this conference to cause couple of problems, and some of the luck that they had last year I don't think will be there this year. North Carolina is always going to be that 8-4, 7-5 team, so I felt pretty safe putting them there. Georgia Tech and Duke at 7-5. I think Georgia Tech is going to be a much better team than their record shows, regardless of what their record is, because that schedule is an absolute nightmare. Syracuse is a really interesting team. I think they'll make enough plays. They'll win one or two, crazy games that no one expects. But overall, I think they'll be pretty middling team. Wake Forest, California, I think are going to be good teams. Nothing necessarily special. Be able to make some plays, but nothing wild by any means. And then you have Boston College, Pitt, and Stanford, and Virginia at the very bottom there. So all those teams, I think, are just fighting really hard battles this upcoming year and won't necessarily be able to make the plays that are needed to be made down the stretch. So overall, that's what I got. I know it's a little bit off the walls, a little bit crazy, but I feel pretty good about it as of right now. I do think Miami and Virginia Tech have a lot going into this season, and I think they're going to hit. So it's a little bit of a gut feeling type one, but I'm rolling with it for the time being. Now let's get to some more specific picks. I do have Miami winning this thing. I do think they are a team that just has the players, especially on the defensive side of the ball, to make those plays down the stretch. I think Ruben Bain is going to be an absolute problem for anyone that he faces, regardless of conference or pedigree or draft stock, whatever. It does not matter. This kid's an absolute problem. I think Damian Martinez and Mark Fletcher Jr. are going to be an incredible duo at running back and absolutely cause problems for people. And then Cam Ward is just special. He really is. He's one of those guys that can totally change a season, and I think when you look at what he can do in this Miami offense, it definitely gets you a little bit excited to watch, that's for sure. I do think they have a ton of talent on the outside. Xavier Restrepo is a top 10 player, or top 10 wide receiver in the country pretty much any way you cut it. Jacoby George is a really good threat downfield. Sam Brown coming in from Houston is an absolutely huge pickup. And then Nye Carr is a wide receiver that I'm really excited to see, a very young kid. But I do think the defense is the biggest difference maker. Simeon Barrow Jr. and CJ Clark on the interior I think are going to both be really solid. They might have some young guys step up there, but overall I think that's a really solid duo there. I think between Tyler Barron, Elijah Alston, Ruben Bain, they're going to have plenty of people coming off the edge to make some plays there. The back end does have me a little bit worried, but I do like the addition of Michelle Powell and Isaiah Taylor from the portal. So overall, I think this team has just made the right moves. I think they've done all the right things, and I think they're coming into the season knowing that they got to deliver, knowing that everyone is watching them, and there's so much going into the season that if they don't deliver, there will be people saying they're a huge disappointment. So I think they're ready to go. I think Mario Cristobal, corrects some of the mistakes that happened last year with some micromanagement at time, that's for sure. So I definitely think this is going to be a very interesting year, but I do think it ends with Miami lifting that trophy. I do think the Offensive Player of the Year is going to be Kyron Drones, though. I think this guy, this is really kind of a gut feeling more than anything else, but I think this kid is going to be special this year. I think his connection with Jalen Lane last year was really fun. This year could be the very best in the conference. And then you add someone like Daquan Felton, who had about 700 yards a year ago. And then Ollie Jennings is the guy I really want to talk about because he led them in receiving yards in week 1, got hurt in week 2, and never came back. And he transferred over from Old Dominion in the 2023 offseason, and he's going to be ready to go. He's going to be a problem on that outside, and I definitely think he's someone that elevates this offense to a totally different level. They returned 95% of the production from a year ago on the offensive side of the ball. They are absolutely going to be able to move the ball. And when I look around the ACC, the big-time question I have around Clemson, I have around Miami at times, I have around Florida State is, can they fit this all together? Can they have the transfers or the new offensive scheme or some freshmen coming in, what have you? Can they fit all that together and make it all work in unison? That's going to be a huge thing in this conference, and Virginia Tech doesn't have to worry about that. It is going to fit because it already fits. Kyron Drones already fits into this offense beautifully, so I think he's going to be the story of the college football season. I think he's going to be the guy that we look back on and say, man, he had a really magical run and led that team to some really, really special things this year. So overall, although I don't have them winning that game in Charlotte, I do think that's going to be the Offensive Player of the Year with Cam Ward just being right behind him. The Defensive Player of the Year I do have coming from Miami. Ruben Bain is a monster. There's no two ways. There's no other way to put it, really. He had 7.5 sacks as a freshman. That is insane. That should not be possible as a freshman, especially in a conference that had some really good offensive tackles a year ago. This year, not necessarily quite as loaded at that position. I do think there are some really good players. Blake Miller at Clemson is a very good player. Anthony Belton is a very solid player. I think at Louisville, if I'm not mistaken. I didn't have it written down here, but a very talented player nonetheless. And I think one of the great things here is you have Elijah Alston or you have Tyler Barron on the other side, where last year you didn't really have. You had Nigel Kelly, who definitely causes some problems, but isn't necessarily the scary player that some of these other players are. So I definitely think it's going to be one of those things where Ruben Bain's going to have more one-on-one battles, and there's not many times he's going to lose those one-on-one battles. So I think this is a guy that is absolutely going to be a problem. If he was eligible to be drafted in 2025, he would have been drafted in he would be drafted in 2025. He might just be the number one overall guy in 2026. That's how good I think this kid is. So overall, a very, very talented kid, someone that can absolutely be a problem for really any offensive tackle he faces. I do have Patrick Payton as the other guy to watch here because both those guys are problems off the edges. Bryant Wesco is my freshman of the year, a guy that I frankly just think is going to make a huge effect on this offense, and he kind of has to, if I'm being totally honest. If this team is going to be what they want to be this upcoming year, Bryant Wesco is going to have to play a huge part in that. And there's a number of other guys that are going to have to step up, but this is the guy that I look at and say he is more like the Clemson wide receivers of old. He's not necessarily this new, last 4 or 5 years, really 3 years, of Clemson wide receivers that have not nearly been at the level that they wanted. Brian West goes back to that normal that they've kind of gotten used to over the last little bit at Clemson, and then TJ Moore is a little bit more of that. So overall, I think Brian Wesco is going to be the guy. I think he might just lead them in receiving yards, and he'll have plenty to say about this offense this upcoming year, but I don't think it'll be enough to get them into the ACC title, and especially if he's their leading receiver, I don't necessarily love where that offense is at on the outside, but that's a side point for later. I do have Cam Ward being the transfer of the year. This was a little bit easier than any other, I'll be totally honest with you. When you have a guy coming in with that talent to an offense with this amount of talent, it's not necessarily a hard thing to figure out. There's no two ways about that. So I think it's going to be an incredible year for the Hurricanes. I do think they get done what they want to get done, which is to win an ACC title, but I do think there's some ers and ahs in there. I do think Virginia Tech is going to have plenty to say about this conference and will make it to Charlotte at the end of the year. I do think SMU is going to be a much better team than people expect. And Florida State and Clemson, frankly, part of me really believes that they're going to make a run into the ACC title, but I'm sticking to my guns. I said about 2 or 3 months ago that neither of them would make the ACC title. I'm rolling with that, and I will take the punches one way or the other. So it'll obviously be a huge year in the ACC. I do have Miami taking home the trophy, but it's going to be a weird conference with a ton of different variables that could go any which way this upcoming year. So it'll be awesome to watch that, but let's take our third break here, and when we come back, we're going to talk about the schedule battle. That's something that always plays a part and definitely will even more so in the 12-team playoff is how easy is your schedule. We'll break down every single conference. We'll give you 2 winners and 2 losers from every Power 4 conference, so stick with us, and we'll be right back with that.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just gave our predictions for the ACC this upcoming year. I do think it is going to be Miami taking home that trophy, so definitely will be a huge year for that conference and a very weird one. I can almost promise that. But let's get into the schedules for the Power 4 and definitely some winners and losers from these schedules, and it'll play a huge part in who wins these conferences, who loses these conferences, who, is kind of into the playoff, who isn't. So it's definitely going to be a huge thing in the 12-team playoff, and I think there's going to be a couple of these that are going to be absolute nightmares. But let's get into this. In the SEC, I do have Missouri and Texas as my quote-unquote winners. they got it pretty easy. I'll just be totally honest with you. The losers, Oklahoma and Florida, we've talked about Florida is pretty much ad nauseum at this point, but it's a nightmare. Penn State and Nebraska, I do think, won the Big Ten draw, and I think Ohio State and USC got a little bit tougher of a draw, but overall, nothing crazy in that conference as a whole just because there's so many teams to go around. The ACC, the winners, Virginia Tech and SMU, really did have it easy, and as you saw in my predictions, I definitely take that to heart for this conference. Florida State and Georgia Tech are under battles this year. They absolutely have a ton on their plate going into 2024, and the schedule did not make it any easier. The Big 12, I do have the ACC, or the Big 12, I do have Arizona and Kansas as my winners. I do think both those schedules are manageable for those teams. And then the losers, Utah and West Virginia, they're fighting absolute battles, and Utah did not necessarily get the landing into this conference that they wanted. But let's get into this a little bit more detailed, and let's start with Missouri. They do start with Murray State, Buffalo, Boston College, so the first 3 weeks, you get a little bit easy. You definitely start a little bit easy, and frankly, it doesn't get that much crazier throughout the season. Vanderbilt, you get a bye. You go to Texas A&M, which is not easy, but then you get a little bit of a game/bye. You play at UMass, and a weird game to be playing at UMass, but overall, I think they should roll through that game. You do have Auburn at home, which is huge. You never want to go to Jordan-Hare pretty much any year. Going to Bama is the big-time one, so A&M and Bama are going to be the two big-time kind of inflection points for this season. I think Oklahoma's another huge game. You have at South Carolina, at Mississippi State, and Arkansas to finish the season. So overall, when you look at an SEC schedule and you see what can be, when you look at Florida's or Oklahoma's and you see this one, it's definitely a lot lighter than the others. Texas is definitely a little bit different of one, and being bad for the last decade has definitely paid off for Texas in this respect. They got an SEC schedule that is a little bit softer than their counterpart in Oklahoma, which we'll get into here in a second. The out-of-conference with Michigan obviously makes this a little bit tougher, but in the SEC alone, you have Mississippi State relatively, that should be a game that they win, especially at home. Oklahoma at that neutral site, then you have Georgia coming to Austin, and that's going to be the big 2-week stretch. If they can go 2-0 there, I think they're easily a playoff team. If they go 0-2, they got some problems. If they go 1-1, then this season is going to be very interesting down the stretch. But at Vandy, not necessarily should be a problem. Florida coming to them is huge. At Arkansas and at A&M at the end of the year is going to be really tough. They do have Kentucky right in between that, so it's not necessarily the easiest schedule in the world, but when you look at overall, it's not necessarily hard by any means. They avoid a ton of big-time players in this conference. No Bama, Ole Miss, LSU, Tennessee, Missouri, or Auburn on this schedule, so they definitely feel pretty good about that in Austin. Oklahoma, on the other hand, did not get a good break. You add in the out-of-conference, and it's pretty much a nightmare. But you do have Tennessee, you have Auburn, you have Texas, you have Ole Miss, you have Bama, you have Missouri. You have a million teams on here that are absolutely players in the SEC this year, and all in the back half. I mean, you have Ole Miss, LSU, and Bama, and Missouri in the back half of that season, and it's going to be really tough to deal with that. There's no two ways about that. I think it's one of those teams that you're going to have to grade on a curve. I have them going 8-4. I think that's a massive win for this schedule. It's really, really tough to play this schedule, and frankly, if they come out 8-4, they should feel really good about themselves. I'll be totally honest. Florida is a schedule that we've talked about probably a million times at this point, so I won't waste too much time here. It's an absolute nightmare. There's no game on here that is not easy or that is a layup other than Samford. They play everyone. That is going to be tough. They play all the teams in their state, which is a nightmare. They play so many incredible SEC teams with Georgia and Texas in back-to-back weeks, which is insane. They have at Tennessee, they have Ole Miss, they have A&M. It's just insane the amount of teams that they face. But let's move on to the Big Ten and talk about Penn State. They got it a little bit easier. At West Virginia to start is definitely a little bit harder, but overall, you have UCLA, you go to USC. Not the worst thing in the world. Avoiding Oregon and Michigan is absolutely huge for this team. They do get USC, Wisconsin, Washington, but no Iowa, which is big time. So I think this is a team that, frankly, anything under 10-2 or under, if I'm being totally honest, is a problem for this team. They absolutely should be favored in every single game other than Ohio State, and maybe you slip up at some point here, but overall, if they don't at least go 10-2, Penn State's going to have some very angry fans. Let's just put it that way. Nebraska is a little bit different of a one. They avoid Michigan, Oregon, Penn State. Absolutely massive win. Don't have to deal with 3 of the top 4 teams in that conference, but have a lot of teams in the back half of this schedule that are going to be difficult. You play at Ohio State, obviously, but then at USC, Wisconsin, at Iowa is not an easy 3-week stretch by any means. So overall, I do think this is going to be a schedule that I think the biggest thing here is they have a landing strip. And as a team that has a freshman quarterback trotting out there, you might just need one. So I definitely think, getting 7 weeks, 6 weeks to really get into the groove for Dylan Raiola is going to be huge. Obviously, that Colorado game in week 2 is huge, but you still have plenty of landing space before you get into that at Ohio State game, which is going to be massive. Ohio State, on the other hand, definitely got it a little bit tougher. There's no two ways about that. I definitely think this is going to be a really, really tough schedule for them. They play the number 2, they play the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 6th, and 7th team in odds to win the Big Ten this upcoming year. They are number 1, so they don't necessarily avoid too many people up at the top, and they definitely are going to be up for a number of tough battles, but no one's going to feel sorry for Ohio State. I can promise you that. The out-of-conference is very easy, if we're being totally honest, so I think they'll be more than fine with this, and it could be a team that, regardless of what schedule they face, no one was going to feel bad for them this year. USC is another team that just has a really tough battle on their hands. LSU in the out-of-conference and Notre Dame in the out-of-conference to bookend your season is a nightmare in and of itself, but in the Big Ten, you have Michigan to open up at Michigan, nightmare. You play Penn State, you play Nebraska, Wisconsin, Rutgers is going to be a really good team. You go to Washington. There's a lot of big-time games on the schedule, and frankly, another team that I think could probably be graded on somewhat of a scale this year, somewhat of a curve where maybe a 7-5, 8-4 season would be huge. I think I have them going 9-3, so I definitely think a lot of this team and think they're going to make some real noise this year, but overall, this is a very, very tough schedule to do it against. But let's move on to the ACC, and Virginia Tech is the first team I want to talk about. They have it a little bit easier. There's no two ways about that. Virginia Tech does get Miami and Clemson, but avoids Florida State, NC State, Louisville, SMU, and North Carolina. So they avoid a lot of these Tier 2 teams, quote-unquote, in this conference. They do get Vandy and Rutgers in the out-of-conference, so going to be a little bit tougher, but overall, this is a schedule that they should be favored in pretty much every game other than that Miami and Clemson game, and if they're undefeated come that Clemson game, they might just be favored at home against them, so that'll be a really interesting one to watch. SMU got it a little bit easy as well. These next 3 schedules all start on week 0, so that's kind of a fun little tidbit here, but they got it, a little bit easy walking into the ACC. There's no two ways about that. They do play an interesting out-of-conference at Nevada, Houston Christian, BYU, followed by BYE. They they get a little bit of a bye before they jump into conference play, and overall, it's not the craziest thing in the world. They do get TCU before conference play, by the way, but overall, it's not necessarily too crazy. Florida State does come to you, which is huge. At Louisville will be tough, but when you avoid Clemson, Miami, NC State, and Virginia Tech, you feel pretty good about your chances. So that's part of the reason I have them going 10-2. I do think they're going to make plenty of noise this year. And then the team that didn't get as nice of a draw is Florida State. I think this is a very, very tough draw for them. Starting with 2 conference games, even if they are Georgia Tech and Boston College, is never going to be easy. There's no two ways about that. They still get Clemson at Miami, at SMU, and a ridiculous out-of-conference with Florida on the schedule as well. So it's going to be really tough. Memphis, that out-of-conference game is a very interesting one to watch. So this is a team that is definitely under a battle, but frankly, no one's going to feel sorry for them either. They are a team that absolutely has their eyes set on a playoff and possibly a national title, so you got to show up every single weekend to do that. Georgia Tech has it tough every single year, and this year maybe especially. You start with Florida State, which is just a nightmare. You have at Virginia Tech, Miami, NC State, along with Notre Dame and UGA in the out-of-conference. This schedule is a nightmare, and another team that should be that should be graded on a scale. I'm going 7-5. I think that's a huge win. Definitely something I'm going 7-5. Definitely a huge win for this conference. Overall, we'll get into the Big 12 now, and then we'll start with Arizona. I think this is a nice little landing into the Big 12 for Arizona this year. I do think it's kind of tough to get a beat on this conference. What's going to be tough? What's going to be easy? Because overall, there are going to be a million different ways this conference can go, but they do get a little bit tough one to start. Definitely at Kansas State and then at Utah is not necessarily easy, but you look at the back end of the schedule and they should be favored in pretty much every game after that. So they should have the ability to, even if you get off to a rocky start, possibly save the season, roll into Arlington with a ton of momentum, and then it's going to be really hard to stop Noah Fifita in that offense if they really get going. So overall, I think this is a relatively advantageous schedule for the Arizona Wildcats. Then you have Kansas. I do think this is a relatively easy schedule as well. No Utah, no Oklahoma State. They do have to go play Kansas State, which is obviously tough. The game at West Virginia and Iowa State are really interesting, but overall, these should not necessarily be a big issue for Kansas. This should be a team that absolutely is favored in the vast majority of these games, other than maybe Kansas State and maybe at West Virginia, but we'll see what happens. Utah gets not too nice of a landing into this conference. I think when you play someone like Baylor in the middle of your out-of-conference, that's never easy, but then they go at Oklahoma State. They go to Colorado at the end of the year, which can't be easy. Iowa State and then at UCF is not an easy last couple of games there. So I think they're going to be under kind of a battle here. It's not necessarily the craziest thing in the world, this schedule, but overall, when you look at this conference, there's so many teams that are going to be tough that if you travel to Stillwater, you have a tough schedule. And then West Virginia always is going to have it tough. There's no two ways about that. Penn State starting off is really, really tough. But then Kansas, Oklahoma State, Kansas State, Iowa State, Arizona, Texas Tech. They have so many teams on the schedule that are going to be big-time players in this conference. So yet another team that should be graded on a little bit of a scale. I think they'll probably go, I won't give it away actually because I'll make those picks tomorrow. But overall, this is going to be a very interesting team and one that it might come to the end of the season. They might not have a great record, but would be a really good team. But overall, this is obviously going to play a huge part in this season. Some people got some more advantageous schedules, and that is going to play into them possibly getting into the playoff and possibly making noise once they're there. But we'll obviously break that down as it unfolds, and definitely a ton of schedules to look forward to. But let's take our final break here, and when we come back, we're going to talk about some Wednesday what-ifs, get into some Week 1 questions that I have, definitely some really interesting ones to unpack, so we'll do that right after this, so stick with us. Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just did a little bit of breakdown of the schedules in the Power 4, gave you some winners and losers from every single conference, but now let's get into some Wednesday what-ifs, and let's talk about Week 1 a little bit. Let's get into some of the big-time what-ifs and how they will affect the rest of the season, and the one I want to start with is, what if there's a Notre Dame Marshall type game this year? What if there's a game that totally changes the way that we look at the college football season and totally changes the way we look at one specific team? That is for sure. There is a couple other games in this Week 1 that I think could fit that bill and could kind of shake up a conference, shake up the entire college football schedule this upcoming year, and there are plenty of really good candidates, but I want to focus on 3 right here, and let's start with South Dakota State heading to Oklahoma State. They are heading to Stillwater in the first weekend. Oklahoma State's the better team. They have the better athletes. They are stronger. They are faster. They have a lot of things going in their direction. They have the best player on the field in Ollie Gordon, but the Jackrabbits can really play some football. They are a team that absolutely is going to cause problems and someone that absolutely can walk into really any stadium and not be afraid, because they're national champions. I understand that it's the FCS compared to the FBS, but this is still a team that really knows how to play football and a team that has a lot of experience on its side. So I think it's going to be one of those games that Oklahoma State should likely win. They should be able to pull away and kind of impose their will, but overall, this is going to be a fight. There's no two ways about that, and I think it's going to be one of those that we look up in the fourth quarter, in the late third quarter, and it's much closer than we expected. So that one is definitely one that I'm watching fairly closely. Colorado State heading to Texas is another one that I'm watching fairly closely. I think this is a very interesting one because there are a couple of things that Colorado State does that fits right into what Texas doesn't do very well, and that is getting to the quarterback and playing back-end defense. If those things are not fixed this upcoming year, Colorado State's going to throw the ball around a lot, and Torrey Horton and Braden Fowler-Nicolosi are going to be really hard to deal with for this defense. So this is one of those games that I don't necessarily think it's going to be a problem for Texas. I do think they'll be able to get to the passer and be able to play good enough back-end defense. But overall, this is one that if those problems are not fixed in Austin, they could absolutely have a run for their money in week one and totally torpedo what could be an incredible season for the Longhorns. And then another one I'm watching a little bit different, on a different scale than the first two, but Ohio heads to Syracuse in the first week. And I think this one's really interesting for a number of reasons. They are absolutely a team that can make some noise, and Syracuse is moving a lot of things around. There's no two ways about that. Ohio did lose their quarterback, Curtis Rourke, as well, but overall, this is a team that has a lot of guys returning into a team that has a lot of question marks going into the season. So this one necessarily wouldn't turn the entire college football world on its head by any means, but definitely would be a very, very interesting one to watch. And that doesn't even include North Dakota heading to Iowa State, North Dakota State heading to Colorado, which some people are actually picking to be an upset. So there are a number of ones in week one that can absolutely make some noise and rock the entire college football world. But we will absolutely unpack them if they do happen, and part of me is kind of hoping one at least does. But what if Clemson knocks off UGA is the other question I have here, and this might be the biggest one in the week one slate. When you talk about what Clemson would have to do to go into Atlanta and knock off the Bulldogs, we would be having a real conversation as Clemson not only rolling through the ACC this year, but being a team that can win a national title, because you're walking onto a field with a Georgia team that I think is the best in the country. I think they have so many things that are just absolutely elite in a million different ways, and they absolutely will have plenty to say about this upcoming year. And if Clemson can roll in there and beat them, it means Cade Klubnik is rolling this offense the way that he should. It means this defense, especially on the back end, is better than I expect it to be. It means that Dabo Swinney has got these guys ready to roll, and they are absolutely going into the season with as much energy, as much hope and belief as they possibly can be. And that would get everyone really excited in Clemson, South Carolina, because it could be a 2018 type year. You could be able to tap into what you had back then and possibly play that really good defense and have a couple of difference makers on the outside and really make some noise this year. So overall, I think this is one of those things that I don't think Georgia's going to lose. I do think Georgia's going to win this game, but there's definitely some things here that Clemson could exploit. There's definitely some back-end issues, possibly the interior, that maybe they're able to run the ball with Phil Maffa. Maybe they're able to get some play-action plays down the field and kind of expose some of these back-end problems for UGA. So this is not necessarily out of the realm of possibility. It's something that I'm not necessarily betting on, but if they walk into Atlanta and knock off that Georgia Bulldogs team, then we're talking about Clemson as definitely a team that can totally win the entire national title, and if they do that, then a lot of people are going to have to delete a lot of tweets about Dabo Swinney. I can promise you that. Notre Dame and A&M is one of the interesting games in week one, and my big-time question is, if this one is decided by 14 points or more, regardless of which way it goes? I think it would show a lot about whichever team, wins which one way or the other, and obviously would show a lot about the team that gets blown out. So something like Notre Dame winning by 14, that would mean Riley Leonard is running this offense really efficiently, and he's coming in off an injury and didn't necessarily have the full spring to really get going, so that would be a great sign. That would mean that they haven't necessarily hit their peak yet, and they're still finding ways to be a really, really good football team. I think Marcus Freeman will be going into this year with a ton of energy, and they would be the team that they expect to be, which is a national title contender, a playoff team, someone that is going to create problems for these teams like A&M. So overall, I think this is one that if you were to pick a team to win by 14, I'd probably lean towards Notre Dame, but I don't necessarily think that's going to happen one way or the other. That's why the line is -1 towards A&M right now. So I do think this is going to be a really interesting game. But on the other side of things, you have an A&M team that has a lot of new things. Mike Elko coming in, Connor Wegman, you don't really know what you have in him quite yet, although I think he's going to be a really good player. If you come out and beat a Notre Dame team that everyone expects to be a national title contender by 14 points or more, everyone's going to be talking about you as the SEC team to beat. I can almost promise you that. They're going to be the team that everyone is looking at and saying, they're the dangerous team this year. They are the team that can get to the end of the year, and them and Texas are playing for a spot in the SEC title. Or Texas isn't even, but A&M is. So I definitely think this would be huge for either one of these programs. But overall, I think it's going to be a battle. I think I'd be very, very surprised if it was decided by more than 7 or 10 points, if I'm being totally honest. But I do think it's one of those that if a team walks in there and into Kyle Field, regardless of it's A&M or Notre Dame, particularly if it's Notre Dame, but regardless of who wins, if they win by 14 points or more, we're talking about them as a national title contender. There's no two ways about that. And an A&M team that absolutely has a ton going into this year that could really make some noise right out of the gate and get some really big eyes that they haven't had really at all throughout the offseason. But this is a huge week 1 matchup, frankly my favorite of the bunch, and I think it's going to be a real tough battle. But if it's a blowout, we're having some very interesting conversations at the end of the day. And then I want to talk about Western Kentucky heading to Tuscaloosa, because could Western Kentucky cause some problems for that back end? And if they do, what are we talking about on Monday morning when we talk about Bama? Because WKU is going to throw the ball. That's who they are, whether it's Caden Veltkamp, TJ Finley, or a wide receiver playing quarterback. They're going to throw the ball. That's what they do. That's the way they go about business. And Bama's back end is not necessarily the strongest thing in the world. Neither is their pass rush right this second. And none of this is to say they're going to get torched by Western Kentucky, but it is to say if they, let up a couple of big plays, if that freshman group with, Zabian Brown and Jalen Mbakwe, if they don't look quite as solid as you think they're going to look, you're going to have a problem because you don't necessarily have this grand runway to figure out all of the issues on the back end. You play USF in the second week. That is not necessarily going to be as pass-heavy of a team, but caused problems last year. They could absolutely cause problems this year. Then you go up to Wisconsin in week 3. They are going to throw the ball, especially with Tyler Van Dyke. I feel like they feel more confident in throwing the ball in that offense. Running is where they'll, butter their bread, but at the end of the day, they are going to spread the ball out. And then you have UGA in week 4. So it's not like Bama has all this time to figure out that back-end problem. They have tons of teams that are going to come in and throw the ball at them. And especially if they see Western Kentucky throw for 250, 300 yards through the air, they're going to have some questions, and they're going to attack those questions. So this is a game that Bama needs to send a message. They need to show that they are, miles ahead of where people think they are. The back end looks really solid. Devontae Smith is the guy that I'm watching most closely at that star position that is going to be huge for this team's success. But overall, I think when you look at this back end, it doesn't necessarily make you feel overly confident. They got a guy coming in, or they got a team coming in week 1 that is ready to cause problems at that area. So it's one of those that could define the way that everyone attacks Bama going forward. They could go straight at their throat and say, you can't guard the pass, then we're going to pass at you. And regardless of if you have guys like Malachi Moore on the back end or Keon Saab, it's not going to matter because the corners can't necessarily play as tight as they need to, and you have plenty of other problems structurally. So I think this is one of those things that it won't necessarily be the end-all, be-all by any means. I still expect them to win regardless of what Western Kentucky does through the air, but I think when you talk about the way that other teams will attack them, a lot could be decided in week 1 and definitely cause some problems for Bama down the road. But overall, there's a ton of questions in week 1. We might just get back to this next week if I'm being totally honest, but that will do it for this edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. Your support means a lot to us, so please remember to subscribe to the show, leave a positive review. It does make a huge difference for us. Also, follow us on Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, all of the social pages for all of the content and updates you could possibly need. We have really incredible people doing just great work across every sport you could possibly want. So anything you need in the world of sports, come on over to GSMC and we have you totally covered. But thank you once again for listening, and I will see you guys tomorrow.